Hello, and welcome to our lecture on 19th century definitions of due process. We're going to be getting a little bit to what incorporation means. We haven't even talked about that yet. And we're finally getting to the ways in which the Supreme Court has attempted to define due process, another thing that we really haven't even talked about. Now, in the last lecture, which, by the way, was this second one here, Initial Interpretation, Slaughterhouse, we talked about how the court said a little bit about what due process is, but not a lot. It said it's not sure, basically, the court says it's not sure what due process means, but we know that it doesn't mean taking people's property from them or their livelihood from them in a situation where the public health and safety demands it. And they limited their understanding of due process to just those specific circumstances. Now we're going to go on and talk about two cases in which the court tries to lay down some sort of rule for determining when a right is fundamental, what does fundamental mean, when a right is fundamental, and a standard for what government has to do to demonstrate that it is not violating the right, or when it is violating the right, it's doing so legitimately. Then next, of course, we'll talk about early 20th century and then modern due process. Okay, so the first case is Hurtado versus California. The facts are very salacious. Hurtado kills his wife's lover, and then there's quite a bit in the text about that. The state of California then indicts him using an information. It doesn't convene a grand jury. The prosecutor just simply fills out some forms and presents them to a judge and says, this is what I've got on him, and I think it warrants a trial, and a judge could agree. The prosecutor is just providing a set of information to a judge to determine whether there's enough to warrant a trial. And so after he's convicted, his attorney goes, you didn't give us a grand jury, you just used an information. And the Fifth Amendment requires a grand jury. And the 14th Amendment says due process, and grand jury's got to be part of that meaning of due process. So his attorney appeals his conviction, and he argues that not impaneling a grand jury before indicting Hurtado and trying him was a denial of a fundamental right under the Fifth and the 14th Amendments due process clause. Fifth Amendment grand jury clause, 14th Amendment due process clause. So what are the issues? It's a little bit long, but let me read through this with you. Whether, there's that word that's important for defining an issue, whether California violated Hurtado's right to procedural due process under the 14th Amendment when it initiated his trial with an information rather than convening a grand jury as required by the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, when you, I believe you're briefing Hurtado for this week, and I would really like to see your own definition of the issue in Hurtado, not just simply a copy and paste from mine. Okay, so that's the issue. But before the court can get to that issue, it has to decide another one, which is the grand jury requirement of the Fifth Amendment part of the meaning of due process in the 14th, and thus binding on the power of the state? So we've actually got two issues in Hurtado, and the court has to answer them in reverse order. If the grand jury requirement of the Fifth is part of the meaning in the 14th, then we can ask whether California violated Hurtado's rights under the 14th by initiating his trial with an information rather than a grand jury. But if it's not a fundamental right or part of the meaning of due process in the 14th, then we don't even have to answer that question. So the rule was a three-part test for what is a fundamental due process right. And this is the first time the court is giving us this. It's the first time it's trying to lay out generally what due process in the 14th Amendment means and how we can tell whether a right that someone alleges is a right is fundamental and thus part of the meaning of due process in the 14th. First of all, court says due process means the inherent and reserved power of the states to legislate and create order. This power, this reserved power to legislate and create order, is restrained only by principles of liberty and justice, which lie at the base of our civil and political institution. And by that, when the court uses that phrase, it means a fundamental right. Fundamental rights are principles of liberty and justice which lie at the base of our civil and political institutions, meaning this wouldn't be a free society without them. The third part is that these liberties are secured by the democratic process, by the right of the people to govern themselves through laws of their own making. Now, looking at this three-part test, think about this. Two of the three parts relate to the power of the state and the people to create that state, to manage the affairs of their state through this government that they've created. Two of the three. Only the third one refers to an individual right. The other two refer to majoritarian politics, to the democratic process, to the power of the state created through that democratic process. That's extraordinary, actually, because what it means is that at the time Hurtado was decided, individual autonomy was not as important as the order created by the state. So the court uses neutrality here. Actually, the court says that the state has to govern through neutral and generally applicable laws that are limited by our history and tradition of protecting some individual rights as fundamental, and then the people secure those rights by governing themselves. This is another sort of like a Hawker restatement of that three-part test. The state must govern through laws of general applicability that are limited only by some rights that we have historically and traditionally protected. Oh, and by the way, did we mention that the people secure those rights by governing themselves? Interesting. So the court concludes that the grand jury requirement is not one of those fundamental rights. It does not lie at the base of our civil and political institutions. If you took it away, we'd still have a free society. It's not fundamental, and thus we don't even have to answer the question about whether the the state of California deprived Hurtado of a fundamental right. It's just not one. Okay, so this is basically a rundown of how the court treats fundamental rights under a due process analysis. The first thing the court asks is a right fundamental? If yes, then one can claim a due process protection. If no, then government can regulate as long as it does so neutrally, unless it can find an exception. We've seen this before. And the fact that there was no definitions caused some real difficulty for us. But now the court actually is attempting to remedy that second point there, the no definition of what is a fundamental right and what is due process. And Hurtado had tried to do that for us through that three-part test. Okay, well now we come to a case called Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad versus the City of Chicago. This talk about graft, we saw a little bit of it in the slaughterhouse cases, but the City of Chicago was taking property from people for public purposes or public projects and things, and it was paying them for this property. If you were a citizen who voted in elections, when they took your property, they paid full market value. But if the property was owned by a railroad, then Chicago paid $1 per acre, which was far, far below the fair market value of the property that the city was taking. So the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad sues. And in this case, the court says that property ownership is a foundation of civilization. It's fundamental. In other words, it lies at the base of our civil and political institutions. In fact, the court says, indeed, in a free government, almost all other rights would become worthless if the government possessed an uncontrollable power over the private fortune of every citizen. in other words, could take the citizens' property and not give them fair market value and take their property just and give them a pittance or maybe even nothing at all. So the court actually in Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad applies the Hurtado test. It applies that three-part test, and it says we're answering it in the affirmative. Property is a fundamental right, and the taking of property without just compensation is a violation of the due process in the 14th. You'll note, though, we've come across this sort of situation before. This is virtually a carbon copy of Barron v. Baltimore. Circumstances are somewhat different, but a city is taking property. In Barron, I don't think they meant to. They just did a horrible job with their public works project, and all this dirt ran down into the bay. In Chicago was very much more systematic about depriving the railroad of its property. So this case explicitly overturns Barron and says that the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment is part of the meaning of due process in the 14th. Well, now we have a problem. The court just told us in Hurtado that the grand jury requirement in the Fifth Amendment was not fundamental. And in Chicago, Burlington, it turned around and told us that the takings clause, just compensation clause, is fundamental. How are we supposed to know whether something is fundamental or not? These two clauses are in the same amendment, and the court came to opposite conclusions. That creates some problems which the court tried to sort out for us in Twining versus New Jersey. It not only attempts to sort out for us when one right is fundamental and another is not, but it also did something that I don't mention here, and that is that the court said it's going to decide on a case-by-case basis whether a right is fundamental or not. Case-by-case basis. It's going to apply on a case-by-case basis rights found in the Bill of Rights to the states through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. In other words, it's not going to apply the entire Bill of Rights to the states. It's going to take them one at a time. That is called, by the way, incorporation. Taking these rights one at a time is called selective incorporation, and that's the process the Supreme Court said it would use in Twining. So the facts are that Twining was a banker who cooked the books. He got caught, and at his trial he refused to testify. The judge instructed the jury, at one point, he says, that they can infer guilt from his failure to testify, to take the stand in his own defense. So the issue here is whether New Jersey violated Twining's right against self-incrimination and deprived him of that right in violation of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Well, the court lays down this rule of selective incorporation, and look at this. It says some things listed in the Bill of Rights may be part of the meaning of due process in the 14th. But it's not because that they're listed in the bill, it's because they're fundamental. Due process in the 14th Amendment limits state power only insofar as things are fundamental. A right is fundamental. The second rule is that the court expounds on its Hurtado definition, and in particular that second point in Hurtado. It says a fundamental right is one that inheres in the very idea of free government and is the inalienable right of a citizen. If it is, this court has declared it to be essential to due process of law. So it expounds on that second point, and it tries to clarify that if a right doesn't exist and free government would fall, then we have to protect that right. It has to be part of the meaning of due process. So those are the two rules in Twining. Our last case is called Palco versus Connecticut. This has happened a couple times in the Supreme Court's history. Another case that it happened in was a case called Gobaitis, where the court misspelled the name of the plaintiff. The plaintiff's name, the petitioner's name in this case, was actually Pauka, and the court misspelled it, called him Pauco. It's Pauco versus Connecticut. So this is important to understand the facts. At Pauka's first trial, the judge excluded his confession to murder. He was still found guilty and he was sentenced to life in prison. The state didn't like it because the guy had murdered someone, and it was real clear he confessed to it. His confession was excluded. They didn't like the sentence of life in prison. They thought the judge had made an error. So the state appealed, and the appellate court overturned the trial court judge's decision and allowed the confession in to be admitted at the second trial. They hold a complete other second trial. New jury, evidence that was excluded is now presented to them. They find him at a second trial, they find him guilty of first-degree murder and sentence him to death. Pauka doesn't like this outcome, so he says, "Ah ha ha, you've deprived me of my right against double jeopardy, and that violates the 14th Amendment's due process clause," and so he sues. This goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the issue there is whether Connecticut violated Pauka's due process right when it subjected him to a second trial to correct an error occurring at his first trial. Now, it's important to understand this because the book has presented this, I think, a little bit misleadingly. There are a number of different kinds of double jeopardy. This was a specific kind of double jeopardy called error correction. The court is asked to decide whether the error correction kind of double jeopardy was something that people were protected against by the double jeopardy clause found in the Bill of Rights. The court, once again, adds some more words to the Hurtado definition, and in particular that second point. The court says that fundamental rights are implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. In other words, neither liberty nor justice would exist if they were sacrificed. That's how we tell whether something is fundamental or not. And if it is fundamental, it's part of the meaning of due process. If it's not fundamental, it's not part. The court decides that, and this is important, the error correction kind of double jeopardy was not protected by the Fifth Amendment. Now, what about other types of double jeopardy? What about the kind where the state just wears you out? Just wears you out and impanels jury after jury after jury until it gets the severe sentence that it wanted. Well, the court says in its majority opinion, we have no occasion to decide that situation because the facts before us in this case involve the error correction kind of double jeopardy. We'll leave a consideration of that kind of double jeopardy to later. Okay, so that was our lecture on early 19th century due process definitions, and the Hurtado test is extremely important for understanding how the court viewed due process at that time, and in particular understanding it in terms of changing definitions of personal autonomy is really important. Thanks for listening, and we'll go on to the next lecture.